Sports Science and Physical Competence Development for AFL for the 2020-2021 program. Topics for this presentation: what does strength and conditioning actually do, the movement performance pyramid, functional abilities for AFL, AFL specific movements, and why is strength and conditioning training so important? What is my role? My role is as a strength and conditioning coach and sports science advisor to the Hunter Academy of Sport athletes. So we do assessment, education and exercise programming for a number of athletes to get them ready to go from a regional level to a state level for their sport. What does strength and conditioning training actually do? So the first thing we consider is the athlete development assessment process. So we look at athletes and we're trying to make them ready to train. So not so much ready to compete, but we assess their readiness for training. So we look at their basic movements. Can they perform their basic movements with good flexibility, good support stability, good speed and load? And can they recover from one session to the next? We then look at assessment of movement capability. Do they have the ability to endure and exert and absorb force, hold form under load? A range of things. Do they have muscular strength, muscular endurance, plyometric ability, velocity? Do they have power endurance? Do they have stability under fatigue? So there's a number of key areas we need to look at to make sure that athletes are ready to work hard and train for their sport. The movement performance pyramid essentially has three levels. We start down in mobilities. The first thing we have to make sure is an athlete can get into all the positions they need to for their sport. So we assess joint mobility, soft tissue extensibility, so the muscles and the tendons, and even neural flexibility as well. So the next step is to make sure they can support the positions that they then are able to get into. So looking at proprioception and balance, body awareness, coordination and motor control, and even can an athlete maintain position under load. Once they can get themselves into position, they can then support position, so mobility, then stability. Then can they apply load in those positions or do those positions in sports and actions for a long amount of time? So looking at strength and power, speed, agility, reaction, endurance, all those other areas as well. Functional ability for AFL. So the first area we look at is valgus loading. So when you have a valgus loading pattern, often what happens is your thighs turn in. So looking at picture B there down the bottom left. So your thighs are internally rotated or turning in, and the arches of the feet collapse. So usually that's a sign of a couple of things. The control on the foot is not working overly well, so the way that you apply load into the ground. Often that comes with a poor flexibility around the ankle, and the thighs turning in, that usually comes with poor hip stability on one or both sides at the same time. So if we can improve hip stability and ankle flexibility in the way that the foot controls the ground and applies and transfers load, chances are we can minimize that valgus loading. The next area of functional ability for AFL is the hip flexor and quadrilar range to allow efficient hip extension. So if the hip flexors are too tight, then the muscles on the fronts of the hips that help to control your anterior posterior rotation of the pelvis and good lumbar position. If they're too tight, what they'll actually do is inhibit your glutes and your hamstrings. So your glutes and hamstring muscles work together as a bit of a combination as a powerhouse for you to produce power movements, I mean running and jumping and changing direction. So if the hip flexors are tight, they'll inhibit that powerhouse and inhibit a lot of load and strength and stability and power. The next area, functional ability for AFL, is thoracic extension and sufficient thoracic rotation. So you need good flexibility through the trunk to make sure you have a nice, efficient postural position. So in sports where you have to do a lot of reaching overhead, if your thoracic extension or your ability to thoracically extend is poor, what you'll find your core stability is poor, and your ability to transfer load from the lower body to the upper body through the core, having good core stability, things just don't work half as well as what they should. So really important that you have sufficient flexibility to rotate and to extend so you can produce and transfer force through the body well. Functional ability for AFL, the shoulder and pelvic proprioception and stability. So important that the shoulders are in the right position and the pelvis is in the right position, and the thing that connects the two, the spine, can then be in the right position for the core and all the muscles around the spine to produce a good core posture and core stability position. So we have to transfer load through our spine and through our core from the legs to the arms and vice versa from the arms back down to the legs again. So for jumping patterns, for running and catching patterns, for throwing patterns, for tackling patterns, really important that our posture is sufficient and the shoulders and hips and pelvis and the spine are all in the most appropriate position. So when we're considering exercise prescription, we often consider lots of individual muscles, the pecs and the glutes and the deltoids and the biceps and triceps, for example. But when we consider sporting movements, what we like to consider is we talk about movement patterns. So rather than individual muscles, we look at all of those muscles contributing to a larger movement pattern. So rather than a quad or hamstring or calf strength, we look at lunging strength or squatting strength. So same applies: pulling, pushing, twisting, rotating and stabilizing. Essentially, we're talking about all the big movements that muscles are providing, but in a combination of movements. So specifically looking at AFL, specific movements for AFL, if you do these 4 things quite well, chances are you'll move well for AFL as an athlete. So rotational stability, strength and power. So changing direction, evading, tackling, power, stabilizing evenly right and left. Shoulder and hip mobility and stability. So essentially first having good flexibility and mobility, and then being able to support those positions. So changing direction, moving into position quickly, stabilizing evenly right and left. Leg strength. So considering initially we start off training generally 2-leg movements, and then we move to 1-leg movements. So 1-leg power, really important that you have good 1-leg power to decelerate and accelerate. And when you're changing direction, running, jumping and landing for AFL. And the last one, deceleration and acceleration. So making sure that you can slow down efficiently and making sure that you can speed up efficiently, and a technique that applies for those things. So quite often the thing that we look at with a lot of younger athletes is, do they have good elastic energy? Can they produce force in a fast way, a fast change of direction? Can they respond to an opponent moving? Do they have good vertical power? So these are things that we often look at for specific movements for AFL. Why is strength and conditioning training so important? So it allows the athlete to move more efficiently for their sport. When we take an athlete on board initially, we want to look at and assess their readiness to see their flexibility, stability, power, those things essentially first. If we can target out the things that you need, we can make you move more efficiently for your sport. So when you move more efficiently, sporting movements become easier, you can move further and with more force and less fatigue before you receive injury. So correct movement and more efficient movement teaches your body to manage training. You have the ability to bear more load under the same level of fatigue and with less effort, the ability to recover faster and maximize adaptation and improvement from training. So if you're more athletic and have a higher level of athleticism, it'll be in a major part because you move more efficiently for your sport.